my advice to President Biden, who's presumably watching this, is pick up the phone, call President Tsai Ing-wen, invite her to the White House, share some bubble tea, and just have a chat.
Yeah, if we can invite the Dalai Lama to the White House, and by the way, I think the U.S. should be doing that more often, then why would we not invite a country like Taiwan, the leader of a country like Taiwan? I mean, talk about a democratic, pro-American success story. It's really amazing how far Taiwan has come. Taiwan is, in many ways, it's a political miracle. If you look at where they were, where they came from, and where they are today, it's one of the greatest successes, really, in modern history, politically. And it is unfortunate, I think, that our government and their government don't have much closer relationship. And unfortunately, and that would be true in any case. It's even more worrisome given the threat that Taiwan faces, and given the threat that by way of extension, we as a country face, and the fact that we share a common enemy and a common rival in the Chinese Communist Party. And yet we're not standing shoulder to shoulder. And in many cases, we're not even talking to each other.
Right. But I mean, ironically, if Taiwan wasn't facing this imminent military threat, we probably would establish normal diplomatic relations with them, because why not?
Well, you would think so, right? But if you look at the 1990s, for example, why did the United States government treat Taiwan like a pariah in the 1990s? After the Soviet Union came unglued and cracked up in 91, and we now have what President Bush at the time called a new world order that was going to be based on, liberal American principles and values. And we're going to recognize former Soviet states as free and independent sovereign countries. Why did we not do that with Taiwan?
Because Wall Street wanted access to the China market and convinced,
Bush himself loved China and the CCP.
You're talking about HW.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think in the 90s, right, because H.W. Bush ended his presidency in 92, and then you had Bill Clinton from 92 or 93 till, the end of 2000, essentially, right? So I think what happened is Wall Street convinced the Bill Clinton administration that what we ought to do is establish warmer relationships with the PRC. And in order to do that, like during the time when Taiwan was transforming from this military dictatorship to a miraculous democracy, that had to be ignored, because that would have affected our ability to do the kind of business with China that a lot of these big companies wanted to do. And I think that, we live in a country where Wall Street has an enormous influence on government policy. And that's like, we didn't have those interests in Taiwan business-wise. And I think that's probably the simplest explanation for it.
No, I think the CCP had some more direct lines to the Clintons than just Wall Street. But that's besides the point.
There was that
the whole Chinagate thing.
Yeah, Chinagate, which feels so long ago. But
doesn't it?
I mean, but it wasn't just the Clintons. I went back a couple of years ago and read the congressional record for when the debate was happening about whether to grant China most favored nation status permanently, which is like trade status where you no longer have to renew every year, and there would no longer be any human rights debate in Congress about China's human rights policy before we granted this trade status to China. And, Senator Biden was making a speech about how we should decouple trade from human rights because, that's what's best for the Chinese people and what's best for the American people. I mean, that wasn't something that was just the prevalent thinking at the time.
Yeah, there were a lot of very, in retrospect, at the time, what seemed wise, because a lot of those ideas, obviously, at the time seemed wise. And there was a broad and very deep consensus, I think, on both sides of the aisle that our China policy should be what it was at the time. But in retrospect, you look back on some of those wild assumptions that were made and the bets. Really, it was a gamble, right? the bets that were made, and they look feckless, in retrospect, in the afterlight, knowing what we know today, all of those assumptions about China's future have been falsified by events. And so now we're stuck with a policy community that still is in many ways has its hands tied by those old assumptions that were made and all the policies that came along with those assumptions, which have been falsified by events, and now trying to break free of some of those old fetters. And it's very difficult. It is pretty remarkable how slowly our U.S. government departments have been able to adapt to the new guidance that apparently they're getting from the leadership.
I think it is interesting. And I wonder if, what you were talking about before, Ian, when you saved us with the bit about the beef hot pot, about, making people-to-people connections with Taiwan and how much of a difference that would make. I feel like the Chinese Communist Party has really been able to use that and in their favor when it comes to, policy people, when it comes to government officials in the U.S., where so many of people have, even on state levels, right, have gone to China on these economic junkets, and they've, seen the wonderful high-speed rail in Shanghai and the beautiful tall buildings, and they've met wonderful Chinese people, and they've been exposed to this like Chinese culture, like all this stuff that kind of gives them stars in their eyes when they think about that when they think about China, and not really the reality of the Communist Party. I think, even for people who are more policy experts, if you go to China, 10, 15 times a year, or like if you're constantly mingling with Communist Party officials, like you're going to be influenced.
That's right. It is remarkable how good the Chinese Communist Party is when it comes to propaganda, when it comes to political warfare, when it comes to psychological warfare. They are very, very good at it. They can be, when necessary, they can be extremely charming. They can sign very lucrative trade deals. Companies find business in China very lucrative, at least initially. Many do. And then only later do they realize that now they're being held hostage, and they have to do whatever the authorities in Beijing tell them to do. Even if it's nitnoid things like you have to change your website, or you have to disinvite so-and-so from your meeting or from your board, or whatever it may be, that they realize they're losing their own sovereignty. They're losing their ability to make independent decisions as a corporation, maybe, or as a university, or what have you, because they have been, in a way, they've been lured in, and then now they're captured. Now they're stuck. And I think that that's happened across the United States. And you're right, Shelley, there was a moment in time not long ago where you were not cool if you didn't go to China. And that was true for everybody. That was true for movie stars. That was true for NBA athletes. That was true for every university president and university program director. That was true for U.S. government officials and CEOs, just really across the board. And those same individuals that could have been going to like-minded democratic Taiwan or to our other allies in the region like Japan or Australia or elsewhere, they didn't. They went to China. There's an opportunity cost that comes with that. And now we're suffering for it. And I think a lot of those companies are suffering for it. You look at the fate of a company like GE or Motorola or IBM, where they've all just gotten eaten alive by their business deals with the Chinese Communist Party. You look at companies like Boeing today, that they're made to contribute to the success of AVIC, who's going to take their market share in the future, and is already starting to do that. It's really remarkable what a cunning job, the guile of the Chinese Communist Party, how flexible it is and how seductive it can be for a lot of these business leaders and thought leaders who don't realize what they're getting themselves into until it's too late, and then they're trapped.
Well, here's something I've been curious about. It's pretty clear how China has influenced corporations, Wall Street, and how they've, bought off or influenced a lot of politicians. What I don't get is why we're not hearing more from like all these pro-peace organizations about Taiwan. Like, a lot of times they'll be very quick to criticize the United States for its militarization, but never anything about Taiwan.
Yeah, it is remarkable, isn't it? I mean, you would think that organizations dedicated to peace, as an objective, like the Union of Concerned Scientists, for example, or organizations that are dedicated towards a greener planet, Greenpeace, for example, that they're so quick to criticize the U.S. government. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what we're doing here today. That's our duty, I think, as citizens in a democracy. But they're so quick to do that, and yet they stay silent on the actions of the Chinese Communist Party, on the actions of the Chinese government. So when China threatens a peaceful democracy like Taiwan, they stay silent. When China militarizes, first when they dredge beautiful coral reefs in the South China Sea and then turn those into giant military facilities, giant air bases, how they stay silent on that. I mean, I remember in 2007 when China tested an anti-satellite weapon. So they fired a ballistic missile into outer space, and it hit a satellite, a very small weather satellite, an old defunct Chinese weather satellite, and they blew it to pieces. It just shattered it, and it created more space debris in that single instance than the entire U.S. space program had created in like 50 years. And in fact, I think as much as the U.S. and the Soviet space program combined during the whole of the Cold War. And yet there was very little outcry from the non-proliferation community. There was some coverage of it, but there was not an all-out offensive against Beijing. If anything, they were very critical of the United States. They said, well, China's just doing this because of, the U.S. forced them to do it. And China's polluting now because, they have no choice. It is pretty remarkable.
I mean, Greenpeace is in China.
It's true.
So
are they all a bunch of communists? I need a simplified worldview.
Okay. Well, I mean, I do think there's an interesting article in The Nation about what the left should do about China.
Oh, yeah.
It's an interesting read because it shows that there's a spectrum of people who identify as progressive or even harder left, who some of them are more in the, China's been defamed by the U.S. camp. I mean, there are the people who are just outright genocide denialists, but most people, I think, aren't there. Well, most people on the left, according to this article, seem to be, and we're talking, people who work in think tanks and policy stuff too. A lot of them were on the, well, there's definitely genocide in Xinjiang and that's bad. But it's like there was a lot of hesitation about kind of doing anything about it or what you could do about it that wouldn't, in their minds, kind of play into the hands of like the right-wing hawk kind of community that they're thinking about. So it was definitely an interesting read. I recommend it to take a look at how progressives are trying to grapple with how to deal with China.
Yeah, I think it's very unfortunate that this has become a partisan issue. China policy should not be a partisan issue at all. It doesn't matter if you are right, left, center, somewhere in between, unless you're far, far left, unless you're a communist and you believe in Marxist-Leninist thought and Mao Zedong thought, or unless you are on the extreme right and you're a fascist or a neo-Nazi. So you're talking about tiny, tiny minorities really tiny minorities of the American population on the far extremes. Unless you're there, for everybody else, 99.9% of Americans should be looking at what China's government is doing and should be horrified by it, based on whatever is your pet political interest. If you're on the right and you're a national security hawk, you should be horrified by China's massive military buildup. If you're on the left, you should be horrified by China's pollution. All of the emissions that China is responsible for, not only within China, but also the dirty coal burning plants that it's building around the world. You should be horrified by China's human rights and genocidal behavior. And if you're in the center, well, then the list of things that might worry you it's almost endless, right? And so it really should not be a political partisan issue. But the fact that it has become that way in recent years, I think, does speak to not only some of our domestic troubles, which are natural in any democracy. You're always going to have political bickering that goes on, but also the troubled China policy that we have. I think there's a lot of work to be done. And happily, thanks to China Uncensored and China Unscripted, we're all going to be able to have much better informed conversations going forward.